The next step after the framing was done was to drywall the room. I left a half-inch space between the edge of the concrete board and the first layer of plywood subfloor. The drywall sheets rested on this so they didn't contact the wood floor. The idea was to protect the drywall and finished area from vibration as much as possible. The concrete board is dense and does a pretty good job at absorbing sound and most typical vibrations. Once I had drywall on the perimeter, I was able to begin placing the Roxul Safe and Sound in the walls. I liked working with it. The 4-foot bats and easy cutting were great. I had an insulation knife that I was able to use, as you can see here, and that really made the job easier. The rock wool was easier to work with than the R13 fiberglass. As I was installing it, I could tell that the bats were denser than fiberglass. What remains to be seen is whether it really helps to absorb sound better. I'll add that my insulation knife disappeared in the room and I haven't been able to find it, so it's among those FLIs, or frequently lost items. It will probably turn up the day after I get everything completely finished. Some of the smaller areas were too tight to place a full bat, so I had to cut and sometimes stuff the rock wool in the corners to fill the gaps. In spite of that, the process actually went pretty quickly. Once the drywall started going up on the inside of the room, things really started to look like they were coming together. There's a vent at the corner of the new room, and one of the things I'll be interested in finding out is whether I've successfully absorbed that sound from entering the room. I was really happy with myself when it came to cutting the drywall around light switches and outlets. I usually get them too wide or slightly off to the right or left, but this time it worked out pretty good. The second layer of drywall covering the angle wall really started to block sound from the stairwell. At this point, I'd gone from 2 thin pieces of paneling over the stairs to an insulated and drywalled area, followed by a second wall with rock wool and drywall. The interior wall presented a challenge when it came to the last bit of drywall to meet the ceiling. I had to make a paper template and cut an irregular line across the top to mate with the ceiling. It took some time, but it finally turned out. My initial plan was to run Cat 5e up into the airspace above the ceiling, through the attic, and then out to my desk. To do that, I drilled holes through the top plate. Boxes were installed for low voltage cables that would include network, video, and USB feeds. Popping the cable access holes out was a little harder for me. When it was done, it looked more like squirrels had gnawed the knockouts loose. I installed PVC Schedule 40 electrical conduit to carry the low voltage wiring. I used 1.5" conduit, I believe. It might have been 2". I needed it to be small enough to sit within the width of the 2x4s and have room to insulate. The PVC appeared to be pretty dense, so I figured it wouldn't be a sound problem later on. I ran pull strings from the attic side down into the room to run the cables later. Inside the room, when I drywalled the area where the cables would come through, I didn't do quite as well getting the drywall cut out around the boxes. I had to trim and eventually broke one of the corners around the outlet. I figured I'd cover that up later since I planned on carpeting the interior walls. I finally had to cover up the end wall, but that was okay because I knew that I was getting closer to actually being done. Seeing the rock wool going in and getting ready for the last layer of drywall was really great. I had to fight the outlet spacing on this since it was so close to the edge of the wall. The outlet box was back too far, so I moved it forward a bit. I had to get longer screws to secure the outlet to the box because of this, and it still is a little bit too far back. I used a self-adhesive fiberglass drywall tape to cover the seams on the drywall. On some builds, I saw folks filling the gaps in the drywall with sound caulking materials or taping the seams. I decided to go ahead and finish the drywall since the compound is pretty dense and should close any air gaps. The dangling cables are for network, video, audio, and USB feeds. I first ran them over the ceiling into the attic and then out and through to my desk, but a few days later I realized that the jacket on the Cat 5 was way too hot to the touch, and it felt like the plastic jacket on the audio cable was about to melt. I tried wrapping them in insulation and even ran a conduit, but that really didn't help. The only other alternative was to run them back into the room and then channel them through a raceway. Temperature with wiring is an issue in regard to its electrical properties, and I didn't want to fight the extremes of hot and cold in the attic and take a chance on interference or actually messing up any of the signals. I also noticed that when I did the pull into the attic from the ceiling airspace, the jacket on at least one of the Cat 5 cables was cut where it had snagged some of the either a nail or something up in the ceiling, so I figured that might have to be replaced later on. I was finally ready to start putting some paint on the walls and seeing how the thing would shape up.